Hello. So here we are, beginning of our second week or second lesson of the series. And I want to talk to you about the way we've thought about management over the last 100, perhaps 200 years. Your textbook is going to ask you to look only at the 20th century, in other words, the 1900s, and beyond, or in other words, into the 21st century, where we find ourselves now in the 2020s. I will look a little bit beyond that into the 1800s, and it'll become clearer once I show you. So let me retreat to the corner of your screen and share my screen with you. What you see in front of you is an agenda that I intend covering here. There are two lessons that make up this series or this video this week. And first thing we're going to do is just impress upon you learning objectives, because that's not a bad idea, and then give you an idea of the theories and introduce one of them to you. The objective of the second lesson is going to be to elaborate upon that. The point of all of this, the reason that anyone doing a course in management principles needs to understand where our thinking about management comes from, is severalfold. The first one is that the emphasis that I've been making or placing upon effectiveness and efficiency and productivity comes to the fore over here. Those objectives have driven our thinking about management, or in other words, our management theory. In addition to that, I want you to have an acceptable understanding, a suitable comprehension of the principles that underpin management theory. We'll layer onto that on the basis of two primary thinkers in management science, the foundations of how to run a business properly or how to manage things properly. But we'll also turn to alternative schools of thought, if you like, that have emerged, that place less emphasis upon hard science and more emphasis upon soft science or psychology and sociology. That is something which brings us almost full circle back to quantitative science, the hard sciences, because that was a feature of the 1970s and 1980s, when I, in fact, originally studied management. And 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 we've reintroduced that because we really do get it, that making decisions based upon evidence is a good idea. Finally, I need for you to be able to think about the way the context in which we operate as managers is something which impacts on not only the quality of management, but also the quality of followership, and that is people taking instructions from their manager. So I think it is feasible to draw a timeline, and the timeline that you'll find in most textbooks is going to start roughly about 1900 or thereabouts. The one in your prescribed textbook happens to be 1890, and in each of those theories, and I'll just highlight them quickly for you on your screen, we're saying that we're going to be looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 bodies of thought, and those bodies of thought seem to have emerged roughly at the beginning of the 20th century, 1890 into 1900, where we realized there was a fairly dramatic increase in the scale of our industrialization, which ties, you must remember, I'm sure, to an increase in the scale of our exploitation of fossil fuels. And I believe that it would be inappropriate for me not to point out that before 1890, it's not like we didn't have any theories about management, because we certainly did. And it's important to say, what was that? And I'll say to you that it appears to have been superhero time, because we know that certainly from about the mid 1800s or thereabouts, there was this powerful school of thought that revolved around great men, or in other words, the great man theory, as I've placed it before you here, with a superhero wearing a cape. What I highlight on this slide for you, which I've clipped from the interweb, is the fact that the school of thought believes that people are destined to be leaders, and 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 believing in destiny is not something I'm going to knock, but I don't believe that it's necessarily in any particular persons to have a destiny to lead a nation or lead a company, um, or lead a management buyout, or a merger and acquisition. It isn't the case at all. I think that it is possible to groom people into becoming better leaders, and in fact, we have no choice but to do that, because there's just so much business that has to be managed. So I'll point out to you that it's in Pennsylvania, in Penn State, you have Madison Gorkis, who writes a commentary, and she points out that the great man theories, and this is just a useful, simple write-up, that the great man theories emphasize the qualities and characteristics of leaders. And I've introduced, certainly in classroom experience, talking about leader managers, because we know that managers lead, because I've told you this, and we know that leaders have to control things, which is a management activity. So maybe leader manager is the more complete expression or description of someone who's a corporate manager. And when I say leader or manager or leader manager, I mean the same thing. To believe, to countenance that someone is a born leader, and that they have these qualities that are ingrained in them at birth, at conception for that matter, is a little bit nuts. But having said that, I'm going to say that I lean towards the fact that there are leaders who are great people. But it is necessary to expand upon that and say that it's not just about whether they're great people, it's also about whether they have qualities we can actually identify and relate to and point out are necessary in order to make a company work. So with that in mind, we start addressing the theories, and the first theory I want to address with you is this body of thought that emerged roughly about the year 1900 or thereabouts, and it emerged with this guy, Frederick Taylor, and we call it scientific management. And you can freeze this, obviously, and make notes, because I'll move along without reading these points to you. What I will do is highlight that in 1911, he wrote a book. What was his book about? It was about efficiency techniques, and he called this the principles of scientific management. Now, in 2001, we said this was possibly the best management book of the 20th century, the 1900s. So that's fascinatingly good praise. And what Frederick Taylor introduced to us was what he did to make a steel business function better, function more, dare I say it, efficiently, productively, effectively. Now, the principles of scientific management, I'll place these before you here, and you can freeze this and write them down. You study what people do. Okay, step one, study what they do and work out what they know about the job, because what they know is what we came in the 1990s to call tacit knowledge. In a field of theory we refer to as knowledge management. They just know how to make certain things work. They're just really smart that way. So what do they do in order to make their jobs work better? What's it all about? Because if we can take what they're doing, their secret little tricks, then we can try and then turn that into explicit knowledge or visible knowledge, no longer intangible or tacit knowledge. Not bad so far. Let me show you what he then says. Select people who have the right sort of profile to perform the particular task. In other words, do they have small, nimble fingers, and therefore can they solder components into a telephone handset? Um, can they thread the shoelaces in a pair of sneakers? Train them to perform that task, and if they can do that, and they can do that to an established procedure, the methods of a job, then work out how many telephones a person should solder, work out how many sneakers a person should be able to lace, and then work out what is appropriate to reward them for that. Well, there is, of course, a danger. The if you want to be mean, you could say that it's worth paying 10 cents for someone to thread shoelaces. If you're not mean, you might say it's worth $10. What is an appropriate rate to pay someone for threading shoelaces? Well, it's a function of psychology, of sociology, and identity, and brand loyalty, because you'd want to have your Nike or Adidas laced just right, and it's also a function of supply and demand, and how many people are prepared to do the work, and what you can actually get away with doing, and whether people need work or not. That business of supply and demand, that notion that there are people who want work and people who have work to hand out, is something which was investigated, in fact, centuries before roughly the year 1900. So we go back to the 1700s, and I introduce you to an economist from that time, and that was Adam Smith. If you've studied economics, you've been introduced very briefly to the work of Adam Smith. What he did was find out that if you're making dressmakers' pins, it's better to have people specialize in one or just a few of the subtasks, that the elementary tasks that make up the procedure or method of making a pin, and that's what's listed over there in front of you. So you you spank and clean the wire, and you draw it out into something which is nice and thin like a pin, and then you straighten it and cut it and sharpen it, and effectively turn it into a pin. Now, if someone was to do all 18 of those tasks, they would take far longer, Adam Smith established, than if they specialized in doing just one of them. So you become a wire spanker. Go figure. You become a wire draw plate drawer. You become a wire straightener. Number 4, you become someone who cuts the wire into pieces. Or number 5, you put a sharp point on the one end, and so on and so forth. That's the way work takes place. There's a whole variety of tasks. And what Taylor brought to us was this notion that you could break those tasks down, have people specialize in them, and pay them appropriately. Problem being, though, as people get better and better and better at doing just this one simple elementary thing, then they can produce more. And when they produce more, they would say, could we have some more money? And then bosses would say, actually, no, because we'd like to keep the money for ourselves, for example. So while this era, I'm going to say the era of, let's say, 1850 to 1910, 1920, while it brought great fortune to a great number of entrepreneurs, it also placed a number of people who worked in factories in a position of great hardship. And that's not entirely what we want. And as we became more and more aware of that, we started to think about work and making people do that work a little bit differently. And that led to two things. It led to administrative management theory as well as behavioral management theory. And we start with administrative theory. of which the basic tenet or principle is that you're trying to organize the way work is done in such a way that you create a method which is very efficient and very effective. In other words, there's very little waste, very high quality. Two people are renowned over here, and that is Weber and Fayol. Weber is or was a German theorist, and he created this notion of what we regard as bureaucracy, which very regrettably has a bad name because we say that bureaucratic procedures are bad procedures. They're not bad. They're great. They're fantastic. But when people render those bureaucratic procedures cumbersome, as opposed to putting the processes together and making them work, if they don't put that to work in a way which serves the customer or the purpose, but they administer for the sake of administration alone, then I have to concede that that would be bad bureaucracy. He maintained that bureaucracy, for want of a name, is based on the general principle of precisely defined and organized across the board competencies of the various offices which are underpinned by rules, laws, or administrative regulations. What is an office? What are the various offices? I'm going to say that we know this. The various offices in a business are marketing, operations, people, and money, those functions. So within each of the functions, we're saying that the activities you perform are underpinned by rules and procedures and laws and perhaps administrative regulations. That means that within those offices or functions, what Weber is saying is that you're looking to administer in the private sector or manage in the public sector, I beg your pardon, or to manage in the private sector according to a rigid division of labor and regulations, and finally, qualified people. What is our point? That you divide the job up in the best possible way, the best rational, logical way, and you establish procedures by which the work will be done, and then you find the right people for those procedures. You only ever put the right people into the job. No square pegs and round holes, only round pegs and round holes. As a theory, I have to say that we still practice administrative management in this way. If you have the wrong person for the job, there's nothing you can really do to make the performance better, or in other words, the output effectiveness and efficiency. Fayol came along at roughly the same time, but on the other side of the channel, and as a businessman also, and someone who in another life might have been called a great man, the Fayol came along and said, when we manage a business, we need to manage it according to principles. And we undertook an interpretation in 1949 of his book, and we call it General and Industrial Administration. He figured that there were 6 types of activity. Now, you and I have spoken about the way that there are mechanisms in a business. There are value creation mechanisms and value delivery mechanisms and value recovery systems, and people work in those systems. We've also said marketing, operations, people, money, and people work in those functionalities. Those are the 6 types. You perform technical activity, and you could argue that I am currently undertaking a technical activity. If I was manufacturing buckets, I would be a bucket maker. We could say it is a commercial, beg your pardon, a technical activity, for which we would have to find someone to engage in the selling part of the process. If I make and sell buckets, then I'm undertaking technical activity as well as commercial activity. If I am Unilever and I'm manufacturing Axe deodorant, then I am performing technical activity. If I give it to a sales division and I say, please sell that to Checkers or Pick n Pay or Spar or any of them, then my colleagues are undertaking commercial activities. Related to both our commercial and our technical activities is the business of managing finance and security and accounting and telling people what to do, or what we call management. So those activities, I think you're now beginning to recognize as something that you would find in those 4 functions: marketing, operations, people, and money. Not so? The tenets of his work were planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. And you recognize this because you've seen it. And you see that there are powerful links over here between leading, as we understand it now, and commanding and coordinating, not so? But what Fail was saying 100 years ago and more is kind of what we are practicing now, is it not? So let's move on. These 14 principles, you have to know. There's just no way of getting around it. You are going to have to familiarize yourself to the point of recognizing when they are presented before you. And I recommend that you pause this video and you make a note of those things. And there's 2 pages, so make a note of this page as well. And that's a quick way to get the notes that you need. I wouldn't write it as it's written here. I'd write it in my own particular way. So if we're talking about initiative, then maybe the best thing to say is managers should promote that workers demonstrate initiative. Put it into your own words, because it's going to make a deeper impression upon how you think about it. Now, I'm going to pause at that point in time because of what I wanted to cover with you. I think we're able to say that bit is done. Not so? But there's another bit which is not done, and that is something which we are going to have to do in the next lesson. I'll see you there.